And brought to you live via London and St. Louis, Missouri. You are watching the AD History Podcast. I am Paul K.D. Costanzo, and I am joined by my co-host, Patrick Foote. Patrick, we have a lot to talk about today because this is an AD History Watches about the recently released Napoleon, starring Joaquin Phoenix, directed and produced by Ridley Scott.
Yeah, and what an interesting... We were having a little chat about it before we went live, Paul. I feel like we've got mixed opinions about this film. Mixed in regards to what you think versus what I think about it. Do you want to start off? Because you were seemed a little bit more negative on this film.
Oh, definitely. Well, I'm going to start with this film just as a film. And for me, it had one very, very damning quality as a film. Despite the fact that in editing, they never let the thing breathe. I mean, really, you go through all of these years and you're skipping through, and the film never breathes. It never lets a moment carry itself or linger, even the slightest bit.
No, it's very, despite like you were saying before we talked, it's almost 3 hours long, this film. Despite that, it's very brisk. It is bang, bang, bang. It's more like a series of, there is a
vignettes.
There is a single narrative through it, and that main narrative being the relationship with his first wife, with Josephine. That's kind of what ties it all together. But if that wasn't there, it would just be a series of vignettes of here's some stuff Napoleon did.
More or less.
That's not really a film at all. A series of vignettes isn't a film by any means.
And that definitely bothered me, because let me give you an example. They literally go from Napoleon's retreat from Moscow, which, might I add, it's like one of the most heinous scenes you'll ever see. It's something straight out of Hieronymus Bosch. All right, you're talking about death, depravity, cannibalism, murder. I mean, it was horrendous.
Oh God,
the retreat.
And they capture it a little bit. You see a scene where they look like they appear to be eating horses, not people, but you see like, and that's kind of a little bit grim.
And that was
itself.
If you were lucky.
Yeah, I just see we've got a comment here from Philip Plus who said this would have been better as 2 or 3 films, and I agree with that completely. This would have been terrific as like a series of make it like a Lord of the Rings style epic. Have multiple, follow multiple different characters. Have it centered around Napoleon, but follow multiple different characters and their path through this. That would have been an amazing way to present this story. Thank you very much, Philip, for sharing that with us.
Absolutely. And you know what? It's funny that you should mention that, Philip. The reason why is because this film actually reminded me of a World War II, I guess it probably was a special of sorts, but it was one of those things where, as far as all that goes, it focused on the Second World War, but specifically Winston Churchill's experience of it. But it was so surface level that literally every scene, every bit that they showed, the whole thing was just following Winston Churchill from his most famous quip to most famous quip.
I guess
that's what this film reminded me of.
That is a great analogy. This is, it's called Napoleon for a reason. It's not a film about the Napoleonic Wars. It's a film.
It definitely isn't.
It's a film. You almost want to call it a character study, but it barely studies the character at all, because the character that is portrayed in the film, and this is something I was talking to you about beforehand, the actual depiction of the man himself. Napoleon's a figure who has a lot of... He hasn't been resigned to one specific thing in the history books. He isn't resigned as a villain of history or a hero of history. He's a very mixed bag of... Just a very mixed bag of a person. However, he's also been depicted as a very silly, dumb, stupid person in caricaturous ways ever since Napoleonic... to time.
Yeah, they had some excellent cartoonist caricatures at the time.
Yeah, he's been portrayed. He's been portrayed as a cartoon for ages, and this film, I feel, very heavily leaned into that cartoon. It's fascinating that you mentioned, especially from the English perspective, Paul, because obviously Ridley Scott is English himself. The fellow who directed this film, he's an English person himself. So I wonder if that played into it. And you were telling me about Ridley Scott's own opinions on Napoleon. He seems like one of the worst people to have made a film about Napoleon.
Let's put it this way: he certainly was. He was definitely not an objective source, but that's all true. And remember a few months back when we were talking about doing this for this purpose, and I said to you that everything you heard about Napoleon is both true and not true.
Yes.
That very much speaks to the point that you just made, because one thing that I will outright reject is that he was some kind of proto-Hitler.
Yeah.
Which is exactly the thing that, of course, Ridley Scott was trying to portray. You get to the very end of the film and you see the Ridley Scott math, and then you see 3 million. And my wife made an excellent point about this. And she's like, 3 million who? 3 million who?
Yeah.
3 million Europeans? Does that also include the Haitians? Does that include enemy armies? Does that include all of the heads that rolled from the guillotine before he ever came to power? What 3 million are you referring to? And that number was meant not as some sort of illuminating figure of who he is responsible for the deaths for. That was very specifically put there to put a number that allowed him to sit with figures like Hitler and Stalin and Mao, despite the fact they killed many millions more.
God, yeah.
And Napoleon has no place with these people. None whatsoever. It is absolute character assassination.
And it's so fascinating. Until Phillips just left another comment here saying they didn't emphasize how the British, including Patrick apparently, were his biggest enemy. And I've never quite fully grasped that Napoleon's image in the UK and the image I have seen of Napoleon my entire life isn't the image of him around the world. I presume that's how the entire world, I presume that's how Napoleon was portrayed through the entire world. And that probably isn't the case. I think I read somewhere that this, I don't know if it's banned in France, this film, but this film hasn't gone down well in France at all. One of the main reasons for that is the complete lack of any French language or any French accents. They're all either British or Joaquin is just sticking with his American accent for some bizarre reason. That was another thing I found utterly strange about this film.
That's not unfair. It's strange because when you get right down to it, the French in general really despise actors who utilize like this very affected and inaccurate French accent. So I get the feeling they were probably trying to avoid that, which I can understand, to be sure.
Yeah.
It's also the same reason, well, in addition to the fact we're probably wouldn't have been all too sure what they sounded like. It is interesting that even today, probably due to Shakespeare, that all Romans in pretty much every depiction you will see that includes a Roman has a British accent.
Most historical figures have British accents in any sort of biopic or historical film. They always just shove them with British accents.
It's hilarious. But as far as his biggest enemy is concerned, I mean, in general, I mean, they kept bankrolling I believe it was 7 total coalitions that were launched against Napoleon in this case. But something that they don't make mention of, or you would never know because you didn't see it at the depiction of the meeting at the Niemen between Napoleon and Alexander I, and what came of that in terms of the Treaty of Tilsit. Really, actually, the biggest enemy, the one that had the most bloodlust for Napoleon, was actually the Prussians, because the Prussians got basically just destroyed under the French Revolutionary Napoleonic boot heel after the terms at Tilsit. And of course, the Russians were complicit in that as well.
The Prussians barely play a role in this film. I think they're mentioned a couple of times, but the only enemies he really comes across is the Russian Tsar of the time and the British Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington. They're the only really like physical forms of enemies he comes up against for big chunks of this film. The British and the Russians, or the Russians were friends supposedly at times.
Yeah, this was an interesting little bit here, Philip, and I came across this as well, and it definitely muddied the waters. But let's put it this way: he still did. He certainly didn't have a particularly high view of Napoleon, and certainly where he sat in history. Whereas you never in this film, you never really see any of the aspects of him, Napoleon, that is, that speak to his better nature, of which he most certainly did possess. I mean,
he did,
and there was a reason why when he in the creation of the Grand Armée, that they followed this guy all over Europe, is because he commanded tremendous loyalty. And one of the things that I definitely did want to talk about in discussing this film with you, Patrick, is Napoleon exhibits one of the most interesting case studies for one particular concept that is debated by historians a great deal. And it's a more of an abstract concept and doesn't necessarily have to do with Napoleon himself outright. But he's definitely one of the best exemplars of this. Is the concept between the great man of history, or the greater contextual forces that drive history. To what extent does a single individual ultimately create these tremendous historical events and are only possible because of their presence, versus all of these other forces that are quite literally innumerable and uncontrollable? And where does he fit into all of this? And he's the ultimate exemplar of this question.
I've always kind of believed, my theory for a lot of that sort of stuff has always been that things are going to happen. Like, if that individual, like if Napoleon wasn't there, someone else would have done it. Or like if Hitler wasn't there, like there's always, what if Hitler died in the First World War? Someone else would have fit that role. Like, times and things happen at a specific moment. Like, there's moments in history where there's a zeitgeist in the air, a sentiment brewing, thoughts, ideas changing, and there tends to be people who capture that perfectly.
Yeah.
And it was Hitler. It was Napoleon at this time. You could even say more recently, you could say Nigel Farage was one of those sort of people as well in more recent history. Someone who just sort of captured the zeitgeist at the time. Now he's in I'm a Celebrity, get me out of here for some bizarre reason. I don't know. That's a huge tangent. But
I didn't expect Nigel Farage to come up in this conversation.
No.
Here we are.
I just feel with history, if something's going to happen, a person's going to do it. It doesn't. It could be anyone in many cases. And Napoleon was there, right place, right time. If he wasn't there, it would have been someone else. I genuinely feel. And speaking of that, something I feel this film resoundingly brushed over is because it begins with the beheading of Marie Antoinette when Napoleon watching, as you mentioned.
I'm fairly sure that most certainly didn't happen.
No,
yeah,
she was beheaded. I don't think Napoleon was actually there. And then within the next an hour or so of the film, we've just seen France reject the monarchy, France reject the king and queen. Yet within an hour, we're seeing them appoint a new king in the form of Napoleon. I'm sitting there like, wait a minute, didn't France just kill their previous kings? Why are they so happy about having a king right now? And the film didn't talk about that barely.
Process at all.
No,
they barely kind of touch on it.
That's what I want to know more about. I want to know more, like, how did the people of France feel about all of a sudden, they just kicked out a previous king, they've got another king now. But this film isn't interested in telling the story of France or the people of France themselves. It's interested in telling the story of Napoleon. Like you're saying with that Churchill film you mentioned, it's laser focused on the man himself.
Yeah, following from quip to biggest quip.
Yeah.
It's interesting because in the case of Napoleon, they didn't crown him king. He crowned him emperor of the French.
Yes, yeah, emperor. Yeah.
So there was something very deliberate there, I think. He didn't want to be a king or a queen. That was vulgar, and that spoke of the ancien regime that the French Revolution ultimately overthrew.
Well, it's exactly like Rome, isn't it?
Well, I mean, look at how he is portrayed, not just in this film, but in the portraits of him following coronation. The golden laurels on the head. He was most certainly reaching out and saying, and I'm wearing, to some extent, the imperial purple.
Yeah.
He was trying to become the new Caesar, the new emperor, that he, calling out to the glory of Roman past imperial past, to be sure, to do that. And ultimately, as far as Napoleon was thinking, and they mentioned this so briefly in the film, that for all that it's worth, he wanted to be able to stand on the same level as the fellow monarchs of Europe in a way that he could not as first consul.
No.
And so you ask about, well, how are they appointing, this another monarch effectively? Well, he did it step by step, drop by drop.
But it barely tells about that. It barely depicts.
No.
If this film is going to be focusing on Napoleon, I would. I love. Sorry to interrupt. I love stories about people, the process of power. It's something I loved about Game of Thrones. It's something I loved about the House of the Dragon, that first series, what we have at the moment. People scheming and skiving for power, finding that vacuum and making their way into it. It's one of the most interesting aspects of AD history, talking about like the power struggle and the transitional power in Rome. Fascinating stories to be had there. And you probably could have a whole film of Napoleon worming his way up to the top. But once again, it just wanted the big battles and the big spectacle pieces. This film was very much aiming to be a spectacle. In many ways, I came out of this film thinking this feels like a throwback, not because it's set in the past, but it feels like a throwback to like those epics of the early noughts, like films we've talked about already, like Gladiator, also directed by Ridley Scott. And it just
the historical fever dream itself.
Yeah, and I'm just like, are we still making these films? Are we still doing this? And
yeah.
Evidently we are. Well, Ridley is anyway.
Yeah. So Philip mentioned in this case, I got him kind of midstream here.
Yeah.
But initially here, I'll go back and I'll get to his first point here because they kind of work. That said, many others have not, and don't know what Napoleon did in the same situation, such as invading Iberia. Very true. The Peninsular Wars were one of his biggest mistakes, undeniably, and two, contributed heavily to his downfall, to be sure. In fact, we all talk about Wellington at Waterloo, when in reality, Wellington's biggest role overall was helping the Spanish in the Peninsular Wars basically frustrate Napoleon's designs on France. And Napoleon thought there was a great deal more revolutionary ardor in Spain than there actually was. And he ended up really stubbing his toe over it, falling down. And in many ways, it was one of the main contributors to why he ended up losing everything, certainly the first time. And he also, of course, mentions Louisiana Purchase. Yes, because the United States, we were most certainly were dealing with representatives of Napoleon. He sold us that humongous tract of land in the United States, a part of which yours truly is currently sitting in.
I was just thinking, surely you're part of the Louisiana Purchase where you are right now.
Oh, you better bet your booty I am. And of course, yes. I would say there's definitely something to be said about that because naturally, with the Confederation of the Rhine created, it basically just, makes the whole Holy Roman Empire pointless and basically defunct. And, several, more or less 6 decades down the line, give or take a few years, leaves an opportunity for Prussia to unify Germany in a way that might not have been possible otherwise. But I mean, we always try to avoid the counterfactual history here because that's such a rabbit hole. But
Germany spends so much time being unified and ununified.
Yeah. Also, he also mentions invading Russia is something others may not have done, and in reality, it's probably something he shouldn't have done. I mean, let's put it this way: he never should have gotten to Moscow. He should never have gotten to Smolensk. He had that contingent was the largest army ever created in history up to that point, over 600,000 troops. But it was supposed to be a much more strategically limited campaign. And he thought, well, if I go a little farther, it may work out. And it ended up costing him everything.
It's probably one of the
Phil
things
was just making such great contributions here. I can't possibly overlook it.
Thank you very much, Phil. And the invasion of Russia, it's one of the most famous things Napoleon did or didn't do, I guess, is the better way to put it. And it is depicted in this film. I mean, even that could just be a film unto itself. Like,
Yes,
it does just
absolutely.
glaze over so much, which is so full of rich detail and fascinating stories. But it was just chosen to be ignored. And something else I think is, I don't know if we talked about this already. The actual depiction of Napoleon himself, portrayed by Joaquin Phoenix, is something I was telling you
Yeah.
beforehand. Um, I think Joaquin Phoenix did a very good job at portraying that version of Napoleon. It definitely wasn't the historically accurate version. They very much leaned into, like, for lack of a better term, the stout little weirdo caricature of Napoleon. And he is very strange throughout this film. He depicts him as being a very odd man in so many ways. Like there's the bizarre sex scenes, but they're not bizarre. They're just very brisk. Brisk is the word I'll use. There's some very brisk, strange sex scenes in this film, which kind of exist not to be hot and steamy, because they most certainly aren't, but they kind of exist to portray the kind of character and man this version of Napoleon is. And that is just so far removed from the person Napoleon was. He, from all accounts, he was a witty, charismatic leader in so many ways. He was also a loving father to his children when he did
And that's
eventually
something
have
that I
them.
think is really something that is really amazing, is that when it came to his son, you wouldn't think it, but he was actually a doting father.
Yeah, there's some wonderful portraits
Yeah.
of him playing in, like, by the fireplace with his son. This son was his apple of his eye. And I think in this film you get one shot scene that tries to capture. I think he's holding the baby as he's planning a war of some kind. He's looking over a map. There's one kind of depiction like that. But other than that, considering one of the main things is he needs a male heir, like, that's a big
A legitimate
narrative
male heir.
plot.
Undoubtedly
Yeah.
had a number of illegitimate children in
Oh,
all
yeah,
likelihood. Yeah.
One of the big plot points in this film, mainly the centerpiece of this film, what ties it all together and gives Napoleon a vaguely human element, is his wife, his relationship with his wife. And a big plot point of that is trying to have a legitimate male heir. And once that legitimate male heir comes onto the scene, you see him for like 2 seconds.
It's true. And also, I'm just gonna get this out of the way, because I don't think you can do this episode without at least paying lip service to this very two important points. One is, during the expedition to Egypt, no, the French armies never
Oh, yeah.
pointed their cannons at the pyramids and fired on the pyramids during the Battle of the Pyramids. And no, at Austerlitz, he never fired into the ice.
Yes, yeah. I knew about the Egypt one, but I had to go and check about the ice. So there wasn't even a massive lake like that, was there, at the time? It was a lot of smaller lakes, I think I read.
That was my understanding of it as well. It was one of the more interesting Napoleonic battlefields. I believe it's located in modern-day Czechia.
Mm-hmm.
And I've always wanted to go and visit the Napoleonic battlefields. Because anytime you're studying military history, you can't really get the fullness of the history itself unless you see the geography of which that was contested. Because so much of a battle, definitely true in Napoleonic battles in Western and Central and then Eastern Europe, but anywhere, the geography is always kind of the independent opponent for both sides that you have to overcome. And to that end, I've always wanted to see that firsthand.
Yeah, like, and I've said this before on the podcast, geography shapes history. History is so shaped by the geography of what was going on. Yeah, that wasn't real, I'm afraid, Philip. Your whole life is a lie. Yeah, sorry about that, mate. But
that goes for that's all three of us right there.
Yeah. What's even the point of anything right now?
Thank you. Thank you for that levity.
Thank you very much. But no, what was I talking about? I was talking about geography and history, and when we've talked about many battles here on AD History ourselves. And this is primarily an audio-based platform. So trying to explain a battle like that, it's so worth seeing maps of where these things were, especially with topography as well, seeing where the hills were, where the high ground was. Having the high ground, it's more than just a phrase in a Star Wars meme. It is so vital, especially in the
how
past.
far that's come, right? Talk about cultural zeitgeist.
But you were saying as a movie, you didn't enjoy this, and so
Honestly,
I
I
was,
found it kind of boring.
yeah, I can see that. I was trying to defend it a little bit before we went on air,
Yeah, I know. It's okay, and I
and
appreciate that,
and
believe me.
in all honesty, I'm still not entirely sure how I feel about this movie. I don't know if I liked it or I disliked it. I enjoyed being in like a quiet cinema on a Wednesday evening. That was quite nice in a way. It wasn't the particularly packed showing on its first day out. That was quite a nice experience. I got myself a hot dog and a big Coke and everything. That was wonderful. Yeah, massive tangent. Um, I was saying to you how a film is made like sometimes when we do make a film based on historical events,
Mm,
I can understand changing the history or brushing over some of the history. It's something I do. I don't change history of name explain,
oh,
but
well, I hope
sometimes
not.
no, 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 no. But sometimes to keep a narrative, because yeah, it's all about making an interesting, engaging narrative.
Sure.
Sometimes if I don't need to go, like I'm writing, I'm going down a wormhole. Wait a minute, I don't need to talk about this much minutia for the main point of what I'm talking about right now. So I just say, and eventually the Roman Empire fell. I don't go into the minutia of it. An example, I can understand doing that at times for the sake of a narrative, for the sake of keeping an engaging, interesting narrative. I'm not
Sure.
saying Napoleon. I'm not saying Ridley Scott did it well here, but I understand the intention. But I don't think it paid off at all because, like you said, this film is just kind of a bit nothing.
Yeah, and also something that drives me really nuts, and more than anything, and my wife very aptly pointed this out. It's like enough with the desaturated
Mm.
picture. And it's like,
Yeah,
yes, I know they look like zombies.
yeah,
It's
and I
just
think that's
so
kind.
hard to watch.
And I think that's kind of the point. It kind of at points wanted it to be a bit gross and gritty. And there was some vaguely gory moments in this. There was that scene near the start when Napoleon's horse gets shot in by a cannon, and you just see that cannonball tear into that horse. It's not very impressive CGI. Like you could tell it was CGI straight from the get go. But like, oh, that's something to see. And I always enjoy a film. This is like my gory, bloody horror side coming out. I always enjoy a film where you see a cannon fired and you see the full impact of a cannon shot.
Yes.
And you got a good chunk of that here, where normally in a film like a cannon fires and it's just a big ball of smoke on the other side, or like a ship explodes. You see people get hit full front of a cannonball, and I always appreciate seeing that in a film. It makes me very happy.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And here, since this pertains to you,
I saw this. I haven't fully read it yet. I was too busy ranting.
here you go.
So, Foot's Law, the older the time period that a film covers, the more likely the actor in said film will have British accent and the more accepting the audience becomes of British accents. I see that. And I go back to a film set in like Neolithic times. Do you think people would buy a cave person, a caveman or cave woman or cave person, whatever? Do you think people would accept a cave person having a British accent? I feel
If
like,
it's Monty Python, yes.
oh, of course, sorry, yeah, Monty, but everyone's British in Monty
Oh, yeah,
Python
you know,
anyway.
I'm just being cheeky.
Yeah.
I mean,
But
at
no,
that point, I
yeah,
mean, what is an accent?
exactly, yeah.
I mean, if we know for a fact that there is a certain accent associated with a certain peoples,
Hmm.
then there can be, I think, some kind of expectation. But I mean, what did the ancient Persians sound like?
Exactly, yeah.
You
And I'm
know,
trying to think what other films have done. There's always like the whole, like, I'm trying to think of 300 an example. King Leonidas keeps his Scottish accent, doesn't he? I think.
I suppose so.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think of how accents are done in different
But
films throughout
here,
ancient
let me ask
history.
you a question because being British and coming up through the British educational system,
Mm.
did you learn about Napoleon at all?
In my later studies, I have no recollection. We probably would have done it very much from a British perspective when I was a little kid, I imagine. I don't have any
Interesting.
memory of it. Most of, genuinely, most of my, the only key British history I remember studying at school in any capacity, it's just you do these vague abstracts of the Victorians, the Tudors,
Yes.
the war. That's kind of how history is taught a lot of the time here in the UK. It was only once I went into like higher education into my A levels, which are, if you're English not an A level, it's kind of a thing you do after original schooling. we did more diverse history. It was all very modern. We did American civil rights between Native Americans, African Americans, and workers. That was really fascinating. But I have no recollection of ever studying Napoleon at school. Nelson, who was studied quite a lot, but that makes sense, and I kind of link Nelson and Napoleon
that
together.
is its own component of the Napoleonic Wars, and with
He's
Nelson.
not mentioned once.
Not in this film.
No, not in this film at all.
They don't mention Trafalgar in the least.
No.
But
No.
Trafalgar was a tremendous loss for the French in the Napoleonic Wars.
Yeah, no.
And you never hear a whisper of it. But if you learned about Nelson, to a degree, you were learning about at the very least one component, the naval component,
Yeah.
and at least his hand in the Napoleonic Wars.
Mm.
Oh man, that guy, oh boy, Nelson.
He's an interesting
Boy.
one, Nelson.
Oh, he was.
I've
Really was.
I've stood on the Victory itself, which is a very fun thing. You can go do it at the Portsmouth Historic Dockyards if you're in the area. Go do that. It's very
still
fun.
the flagship of the Royal Navy, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't think it's had many battles recently, though.
Thankfully it has not.
No.
If you want to keep her in one piece,
So-
but okay, you were about to say something.
Yeah, I was going to say, normally when we do an AD history watches, this was especially the case of our previous one, Oppenheimer, and you were talking about how, because I was saying to you beforehand about how you can kind of, I'm okay with changing the history if it makes a more interesting narrative and film. And you retorted saying, what about Oppenheimer? And yeah, Oppenheimer is a very good film, and it's very true to the history. And that's thankfully because Oppenheimer's life unto itself was extremely fascinating and worthy of a movie. But then again, so was Napoleon. So what went wrong here? And it's just the depiction of it was just all kinds of out of whack. I think what would have, Ridley Scott maybe should have focused on one specific event in Napoleon's life, as opposed to going for this complete overarching narrative of more or less his entire life.
See, for me, I would have appreciated a film that, in the characterization of Napoleon, caught him in a more holistic way, where I came away walking away from it, asking myself, well, where I walked away asking more provocative and more interesting and more productive questions than the ones that I did come away with, which is I wanted to see something a bit more ambiguous, because Napoleon is inherently ambiguous, because it's interesting. It's like 7 Wars of Coalition. Of all the wars he fought, there were 7 launched against him, and only 2 he initiated himself. The invasion of the Iberian Peninsula and the 1812 Russian campaign. Which is something really interesting. You don't think about that about Napoleon many times being the one that was actually on the defensive in the grand strategic sense, as was the whole French Revolution from its very onset.
Because the film, once again, doesn't particularly go into much detail with that.
No, and there's also just a very, very brief explainer at the very beginning regarding what the French Revolution was all about.
Yeah.
And
Ridley Scott loves a word on a screen, and I'm a big believer.
He does. That's a very fine point. He does love a word on a screen.
This film is bookended with both words on screens. I believe Gladiator ends with words telling us that Maximus ended the Roman Empire and entered the Roman age into a new republic, which is just all kinds of effed up. It's like, you're going to leave me with that? That's how you're going to end this film? But I remember The Martian, which is actually one of my favorite Ridley Scott films. The Martian is particularly bad. That's a great comment from Kristen there. What we'll talk about. The Martian is particularly bad for it. Massive tangent, sorry. Every character you see in The Martian has their name and occupation come up. And just tell me through filmmaking who they are and their name. Have another character introduce them. To me, it feels like incredible to have words on a screen in a film or TV show. Just feels like incredibly lazy filmmaking that could have been done through showing me as opposed to literally telling me.
Yeah, show don't tell is really where it's at.
Yeah,
That's
show
really
like
where
Breaking
it's at.
Bad or Better Call Saul. do it incredibly well. Like, you will see what the date is. Like, it will show you a license plate, and from there you can pick up the location and the year or that sort of thing. It's that's a great way of doing it. And Ridley Scott's always struggled with it. Anyway, I want to see Kristen's comment here about Ridley Scott fundamentally interpreting Napoleon's character
I mean,
incorrectly.
certainly. I mean, insofar as he did so incomplete, and doing so in an incomplete fashion, to be sure.
And that was his intention. I get the impression Ridley Scott, he's more or less said in interviews that he doesn't like Napoleon, and he kind of wanted to make a hit piece. I feel in some ways of just absolutely burying this guy's reputation and image. Yeah, it's so, like, if you don't know anything about Napoleon, and I'm not a major scholar in the history of Napoleonic history, but I'm curious enough to go, was that actually real? If you're not curious enough or don't know anything, you would watch that and just think, oh, he was just this weirdo who did some things and died on an island.
And it was a total truth that only,
Yeah.
Well, let's put it this way. When it comes to Napoleon, there was this old quote, is that he made love like he ate, fast. That's all I'm going to say about that.
That is shown. Him eating and making love very quickly are both depicted in this film. There's that scene where he crawls underneath the table to his wife, and that's something else I want to talk about. Normally in these podcasts, we like to talk about the other characters, but there really isn't. I feel like the other characters really didn't do all that much. I can't remember. Vanessa Kirby, I believe, is the lady who played Josephine. She was really good in the role, but no one else particularly felt like a well-rounded character. I felt like most of the other characters were here to just serve the purpose of Napoleon.
Okay, now here's something that is really strange in this film. Is the constant mentioning of Napoleon's mother.
Uh-huh.
Did you notice this? Because I sure noticed this.
I didn't notice this, funny enough. I know he came from
Corsica.
minor royalty.
He was minor nobility on Corsica.
Nobility, yeah.
And his father, when the French purchased Corsica from the Genoese, basically sided with the French and got his boys, including Napoleon in particular, a scholarship to an academy in metropolitan France for his own education. And initially, Napoleon was a Corsican patriot, but by the time he comes back, which is years later, he's trying to export the revolution to Corsica, and Corsica's not having it, and it led to him and his entire family being expelled from Corsica. Corsica has a history of not taking well to outside rule. And there's no question that Napoleon had tremendous reverence for his mother. He was quoted as saying, and this is about as high a compliment you'll get out of Napoleon regarding a woman. Remember, this is late 18th, early 19th century, and Napoleon was Napoleon. He said she had a woman's body, but a man's head on a woman's body.
Yeah, that's not great.
But Josephine in particular keeps mentioning her like she's this puppet master from afar of everything that was happening. That didn't happen. She was around. She was given this this title. I forget what it was like something like Mayor of the Empire or something along those lines. But she wasn't this this puppet master behind the scenes. And the way Scott tries to depict it, especially with Josephine de Beauharnais, keeps referencing, oh, you wouldn't be anything without your mom. What the hell are you talking about? Yeah. That doesn't make any sense. That's not what happened.
No.
Simply not what happened. A big part of Napoleon's life, he loved her dearly and respected her beyond all others. But this was not his mom's grand design.
No.
At all.
Yeah, I didn't even pick up on that all that much. Like I said, I went to a sleepy Wednesday night showing of it, so I definitely didn't fall asleep, but maybe I didn't pick up on everything going on at the moment. But no, that is a very strange kind of almost feels like half a thread, like to dangle the whole mother concept, but don't actually show her or like pay it off in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, it was. I just don't fully understand
No.
it. But somebody that we do need to talk about in terms of other characters is Josephine in this, because
Yeah.
she's supposed to be the other great character in this film, who definitely, next to Napoleon, gets the most screen time.
Well, it's their story. It's a series. I think Philip here just referred to it as a highlight reel of Napoleon's life, and that's a really
Yeah,
good way to
pretty much.
a very historically inaccurate highlight reel, but to have a thread through it. It is portray the relationship between him and Josephine, even after they divorce, is the thread that unites this film together.
Yeah, and
And
they
it is
had a
vital that that relationship is portrayed well. They didn't. What would be interesting, Paul, to know from yourself is you watch them like they should just have broken up and never been together because they are not good for one another. Is that the reality of the situation?
so it's an interesting story.
Mm.
So they were actually fixed up through a former lover of Josephine's.
Mm.
Right? There was nothing about one of her kids coming in looking for their father's sword.
Yeah,
after
that came
he
out of
was
nowhere.
executed. Yeah, they were fixed up. And for Josephine, and this is unfortunate, but it's very much a product of the time and place in which they were, is so her husband was killed in the revolution. She herself was in prison for a good deal of the early revolution. I believe she was originally from the Caribbean, Saint Martinique, I believe, or Martinique. And she was notably older than Napoleon was.
Oh, okay. So he doesn't
Yeah,
portray that at all.
so she had been married. She had kids, and she had, she was a woman who, having suffered the worst, not the very worst herself, but in losing her husband lives and having to deal with, in many cases, some of the worst excesses of the French Revolution, basically was somebody who was not going to allow herself not to enjoy the best life had to offer after all of that, to be sure. But she knew as she was getting older, she was going to need a protector and a provider of some sort, because she was getting older and she was very self-conscious of that, in terms of her, somebody who spent, at one point, 1,000,000 francs a year on new clothing, was very aesthetically conscious,
Yeah.
specifically about herself. And so she ends up marrying Napoleon, who's apparently like 3 hours late to their wedding. And he's totally infatuated with her. She finds him more or less kind of repugnant. She had trouble not being, like physically repulsed by him.
And that's not how the film portrays it at all.
Not initially. You would think it would be more so, but within 3 weeks of their wedding, she was fooling around again, and they don't show any of the time in Italy. But he's, when Napoleon is in charge of the French army that invaded Italy, he wants her to join him. It's basically like pulling teeth. She eventually does it. And when they get down into the Egyptian campaign, that's when he finds out, and this is historically accurate in the film, to its credit, how he finds out about her infidelity from one of his brothers. He's not pleased. And so he immediately then takes on a lover from one of the wives who's present from one of the officers that's in the French army that had invaded Egypt. Because in that case, in that time and place, the concept of being cheated on and run around by from your wife is far worse than the status of being a known adulterer yourself.
Yeah.
And he went on to have 22, I believe, known mistresses throughout his rule and his time. But when he gets back to France, they have what I've heard described as a truly, and I put quotes in the air, Gallic row. And after that point, it becomes something a bit more mature because for Josephine, and there are so many letters there going back and forth between them, though early on a lot more coming from Napoleon that are coming back from Josephine. She finds it somewhat absurd that she has this young man just totally lusting after her, totally in love. She finds it absolutely insane. But when he gets back from Egypt and they have this quote unquote Gallic row, it begins to turn into something more of a fruitful partnership. In addition to that, what Josephine really does for his career is actually give him access to some of the best intellectuals that are present in France and Paris in particular, in terms of the best salons in that regard. And something you don't see in this movie at all, it's actually a lesser known story. One thing that's undeniable, Napoleon was a pretty smart guy. And he had a lot of respect for intellectuals in particular. Writers, artists, painters, sculptors, you name it. He very much was all about patroning the arts. And there's this fascinating story where, and this is true, we know this is true, where Napoleon, back when he was still first consul, actually spent a day with Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, one of the, if not the foremost intellectual of Western Europe at that time. Because Goethe, prior to Napoleon appointing himself emperor, was a big fan of Napoleon. And they spent the whole day together just kind of debating and discussing and exploring various topics. And apparently even Napoleon saying, you know, Goethe, you should come back to France, come to Paris, where we can provide you all the resources you would ever want or need to continue your work. That is the kind of guy Napoleon was. And in the case of Josephine in particular, she gave him access to those kind of major intellectuals in the best salons in Paris. And she also knew people. And she knew how to, she had to know how to maneuver socially. She knew how to present yourself. And
that
she was very accomplished in all of that.
Yeah, and that person just wasn't in this film.
Yes. Oh, yeah. I love this. Yes. Yes.
So, Paul, we have about 5 minutes left to go before I unfortunately have to go off to
I know.
training class.
Yes, so indeed. This one was supposed to be very focused, and I think we focused it as well as we can.
Yeah, the final thing I'm left wondering is, why didn't he just stay on Alba? Like, I would happily be paid a lot of money to go sit on a Greek island forever and not do anything. That sounds perfect. Why don't you just stay there, Napoleon?
I can only answer this in with one way, because if that satisfied him, would he really be Napoleon?
That's exactly it. Because the kind of person Napoleon was didn't want to. That's why I would never be a Napoleon type, because I'm the kind of person who's very happily to just sit on an island all day and not do anything. It takes me a while to realize there are people out there who aren't satisfied with that. And yeah, I'm never going to be one of those people. I'm never going to be a Napoleon, I'm afraid.
And also, remember, him being sent exiled to Elba like that was an intentional slap in the face. It was, because Elba is just this tiny island. It has a little over 10,000 inhabitants. And he makes tremendous difference on that island in terms of reorganizing it, proper garbage collection, you name it. And that's one thing, and with only this couple of minutes left here, in terms of the things that this movie would never dare to show us, are all the things that Napoleon initiated in terms of rebuilding France and modernizing France. You know, the sewer systems, revitalizing the arts, obviously modernizing the army in tremendous ways, seeing his charisma, seeing him as a builder and creator and somebody who helped unleash the potential, the great potential of France that could never have been unleashed under the Ancien regime, because there was one thing that Napoleon should always be remembered for, that this film never shows, never alludes to, not a part of it whatsoever. Even though he really should have done it with his, instead of appointing his brothers as the various kings of these various other countries and places they were in charge of. Overall, Napoleon was a tremendous believer and applied meritocracy in a absolutely vigorous fashion. He believed in meritocracy, and through meritocracy, he very much opened up the great potential of France. And you look at the skyline of France today, and you see so much of what Napoleon initiated and unleashed in the great creative powers of that
I can understand
people.
why the French don't like this film now. And I think the final thing to just end this on quickly, Paul, is that those last words that appear on the screen, what were supposedly Napoleon's last words, were like France, Army, General, Josephine, something along those lines.
Those are supposed to be his last words when he died on St. Helena.
They aren't his actual last words from what I've
Those are legendary last words.
No. So I think that just perfectly sums up that even the last lines in this film aren't even accurate.
Well, let's put it this way. You cannot understand modern France without understanding the entirety of who Napoleon was. You cannot understand Charles de Gaulle's actions in effective exile during the Second World War and how he chose to act without understanding who Napoleon was and what he did for that country. There's a reason why when the British brought his body back 20 years after he died on St. Helena, that there was a massive state funeral, because I have absolutely no misunderstanding why the French, in many cases, are as fond of Napoleon as many of them are. I'm sure there are detractors, because there are always detractors, but he is, in many respects, I know Andrew Roberts described him as the revolution on horseback. But when I think of Napoleon, I think of somebody who definitely helped end the horrific excesses and the terror that came from the revolution, and somebody who shook up Europe in a way that the other monarchs of the time most certainly would never have.
No.
And that without Napoleon, we would not have the France we know and love today.
Vive la France.
Vive la France. France éternelle, vive Napoleon. Us here, you there, and thank you for joining us in this
Thank you
brief,
very much for joining
but
us.
very focused edition of AD History Watches for Ridley Scott's Napoleon. Until next time.